Good morning, everybody. Thank you, David, for making our eyes shine already this morning. It's good to see everyone and new faces. This week, we're going to begin a 5-week process looking at the universal question of the calling or the great work of our lives and how to live life with purpose. And this question is addressed by spiritual traditions. It's been the subject of myth, of story, of poetry, of song, of art through the ages. We wrestle with it in our dreams and in our everyday lives. And for 5 weeks, we're going to be exploring this question as individuals and as a community. So we're going to use the book by Stephen Cope. It's called The Great Work of Your Life, A Guide for the Journey to Your True Calling. And that will be the guide for our conversation. In it, he has gathered stories, extraordinary, ordinary people and their lives. And we will share our own stories, each other's stories. Brian Vander Ark and Bob Kleinhexel will come on alternate Sundays and bring stories. And David Dean will facilitate 2 Wednesday evening book discussions. The first will be this Wednesday evening, and there will be homework. So every Sunday, there will be a reflection question that we ask you to take home and work with during the week. And that will come at the end. Because on September 25th, which is our last Sunday of the series, we have a final exam. Not really, but we will have a special gathering, and it'll be participatory. And we want people to come prepared to share what we've learned from these conversations about living our life's purpose. So this question came up for me, as it does in a recurring way in our lives, but it came up for me recently when it dawned on me that I would be leaving Nicaragua and coming back to the United States. And I did not want to, and I was quite distraught about it. So I called my friend David, who is an Episcopal priest. I've talked about him before here. He came to stay with us in Nicaragua at a time of discernment in his own life about work and purpose. And at that time that he was with us, I saw this friend who had grown up in the poverty of Appalachia listen to a call from within him that was leading him out of the church and the status and the security that it conferred into his vocation, which is a meditative form of body work that he now practices and teaches. And he happens to be coming here in October. So we'll be offering a workshop for this community. More about that later. But this is the person I called. And I called David and I poured the whole situation out to him, and he said to me, "Well, Jenny, you were just flat on the floor of your chariot." And I said, "What?" But he had gotten my attention. Something rang true. And so with him in California and me in Managua, he said, "Sit down and let me tell you the story of the great warrior Arjuna, and how he came to see that the battlefield he was on was actually spiritual in nature, and how he was being asked to know again who he was so he could act rightly, align himself with the call of the times, and assent to the ongoing work and purpose of his life." The spiritual traditions tell us that each individual has a calling, a vocation, a dharma, a sacred duty, and that it resides in the authentic self, close to the core. That it is as unique to each person as a fingerprint or a snowflake, and that it comes out of the essential nature of a being. It makes our eyes shine. That it is to be discerned, to be brought forth and lived out, to be fully alive. Stephen Cope writes, "Scientists now tell us that every brain is like a fingerprint, utterly unique. So too, every nervous system has its own complex idiosyncrasy. Every human mind, every human body, every spirit. We might say that every person's dharma is like an internal fingerprint, a subtle interior blueprint of the soul. So the question is, how do we find this internal fingerprint and read this interior blueprint that connects us to our dharma, our calling, our purpose? Cope says that one finger that points to it are our peculiar and idiosyncratic fascinations, otherwise known as our gifts, and that these can often be identified at an early age, and they must be seen, reflected, nurtured, cherished by parents, teachers, friends, and community. In some cultures that I've had the opportunity to live with, the community carefully observes every child from an early age, and they're looking for those idiosyncrasies, those gifts, for the unique nature and being of each particular child. And when it shows up, they name it. It's often given as a nickname or a spiritual name, and that name says, "We see you. We see your unique gifts. We see your essence. We see what you will bring to this community and to the world." One of the first stories in the book is the story of Jane Goodall. And in it, she's talking about how at age 4, she disappeared for a period of time, a couple of hours, and had the family in a panic. And after 4 hours of having gone missing, she comes out of the hen house, where she has been sitting under a chicken, watching to see how the egg was going to come out. And she was ecstatic with discovery. And Jane Goodall talks about this as being a key moment in her life and in her path, in her dharma. Because at that moment, her mother saw her shining eyes, her wonder, her curiosity, her capacity for observation, her fascination with seeing. And instead of scolding her for scaring them to death, she mirrored it, she cherished it, she nurtured the gift. And it was trust in that gift and her true self that took young Jane Goodall to the Gombe forest, where she continued to get into trouble, to break rules, to not conform, to name chimps, to relate to them, to love them, and to be ecstatic with discovery. William Everson writes, "You are the inheritor of a unique set of gifts. Never before in the world were they created. There is a certain transection of energy which reaches an apex utterly in you." And Jane Goodall's shining eyes led her to that apex in her. And today, the story of her life and purpose and service makes everyone's eyes shine. 2 weeks ago, when I was speaking, I talked about Juan, a young man who, from Nicaragua in the mountains in one of the communities where I lived, who got polio as a child and is paralyzed from the waist down. And he has lived his life in a chair. More recently, it's a wheelchair. But he still can't go very far in these rugged mountains in that wheelchair. So my friend Tina's kitchen in her little home is his axis mundi. He talks to everyone who comes in. He listens to all the conversations. He monitors news on the radio morning and night. Visitors bring him books, newspapers, all of which he devours. He knows the comings and goings of everyone. And from this unique position, he is an invaluable source of information to the community. And so when this community got a little language school off the ground and running, and at one point they decided they were going to need a library, which was remarkable because in these mountain communities, there are really no libraries. In Nicaragua in general, there aren't many libraries. But what was even more remarkable was that when this community built this library at the top of this mountain, they built it with a wheelchair ramp. And they gave the keys to Juan. And they named him. They said, "You're the coordinator of this library." Because all along, they had been seeing his shining eyes, his gift, his purpose, that apex in him, and how the entire community benefits from the essence of his being. So in these stories of Juan and Jane Goodall, we see where families and community are seeing and nurturing gifts. And this is an example of what Stephen Cope calls a direct path to Dharma. But more often than not, the path is indirect. And gifts are not always mirrored. Sometimes they may be discouraged. And sometimes, early on, we may be actively thrown off our path. Parker Palmer writes, "In our culture, we often spend the first half of our lives abandoning gifts, letting others disabuse us of them. We are surrounded by expectations that may have little to do with who we really are, and we learn to conform. We are trained away from our true self toward acceptability, conformity. We fit into slots. We may betray ourselves." The dominant culture tells us that our purpose is to be successful, to get a job that confers status, that defines who we are, or attach ourselves to someone who has one. That our worth, it tells us, is often linked to the money that we make, our capacity to accumulate things and wealth, to be strong consumers, and that everyone can do this. And if we don't, we are failures or we have a problem. There's a very strong message in our culture that this is the purpose of our life. And children are groomed for this from an early age. There's this pressure to conform. I was just dropping my younger daughter to college last week, and it was move-in day on campus. They had it really well organized, so you pull up, and they have all these students available to help move all the things into the room. So we pulled up and opened the back of our car, and about 10 students came over to help us, and they looked in and they said, "That's it?" And we said, "That's it? Just one car?" "Just one car." "No trailer?" "No trailer." And they said, "This is going to be quick." And I said to Olivia, "Just one car, trailer?" And then we saw a trailer going by. And then I saw a horse trailer go by. And I said, "Well, look, there's a horse trailer." And then I saw it pull up to the back of the dorm we were going to, and there was no horse in the trailer. There was stuff in the trailer. Last semester, Olivia had a course in economics. And she really liked this teacher, a young woman who kept bringing these stories from her personal life about these amazing things she was doing, trying to live her purpose and her life gifts. But in the classroom, what she was teaching the students was, the bottom line is, guys, she said, you need to set yourself up to be making 4 payments for the rest of your lives the day you get out of this school. Student debt, car loan, mortgage, and credit card. This is a strong message from our culture that this is the purpose of our lives. When what we need to be doing is having conversations with our young people and with ourselves about the need to live simply, sustainably, to stay out of debt, the need for mass transit and co-housing, access to affordable education, universal health care, and living our lives with purpose, creating communities, societies, and economies that see, name, nurture gifts, and put them at the service of the times. Parker Palmer, again, says, we are trained away from our true selves. We learn to conform, consume, fit into slots. We may abandon ourselves. Marion Woodman is a Jungian psychologist whose story is in the book. You'll get to it if you haven't gotten to it yet. She has a poem about this. The poem says, in her dream, a pen a paintbrush. Do you ever paint? Nope, I can't paint. My sister's a good painter. I could never paint. Her dreams are full of brushes, colors, a woman painting. Something happened, I stopped. Her dreams are full of brushes, colors, a woman painting. I really do love painting. Sooner or later, we have to take responsibility for who we are born to be. The spiritual traditions tell us there is great peril when we disconnect from our gifts, our vocation, our deep purpose, and that this disconnect comes at a great cost to self and to society. Stephen Cope quotes the Gospel of Thomas in the book, where Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, it will destroy you." Poet David White writes it this way: "I look out at everything growing so wild and faithfully beneath the sky and wonder, why are we the one terrible part of creation privileged to refuse our own flowering?" Stephen Cope says, we must stay with the gift. We must stay with our own flowering. And we need to know that our purpose, our work in the world, does not necessarily mean a job or something that we're paid to do. And we can make decisions accordingly. Poet Mary Oliver writes about staying with her gift. She says, "Early in my life, I determined that if I was going to write the best poetry I possibly could, I needed to choose it, guard it. I knew that if I did not live my life immersed in the one activity that keeps me utterly happy and intrigued, I would come someday to be bitter with mortal regret. Of necessity, I worked for many years at many occupations, none of them interesting. And I learned in those years that one can rise early in the morning and have time to write before the workday begins, and that one can live simply and honorably on just about enough money to keep a chicken alive, and do so cheerfully." That's Mary Oliver. So I don't know about you, but I didn't really get that message growing up. I didn't get stay with your gift, choose it, guard it. You can live simply and honorably on just about enough money to keep a chicken alive. What I heard in response to most things that I felt called to do in my life was more like this. You're not going to make any money doing that. What are you going to do about health insurance? You are never going to be able to retire. And I internalized those voices. We all do. But the call was always more compelling. And I too, like Mary Oliver, knew at the core of my being that if I didn't follow it, I would pay a greater price. Mary Oliver calls it mortal regret. Parker Palmer calls it self-betrayal. Jesus says, if you don't bring forth what is within you, it will destroy you. All in their own way say something inside of us dies when we don't live our gift. And society and the earth pay a price too. When so much life, energy, purpose, creativity goes unlived, when so many internal fingerprints and snowflakes go unseen, when we become obsessed with test scores rather than gifts and flowering, when we become addicted to consuming and we value money over the quality of life, conforming over authenticity, and war over peace. Depression, anxiety, addiction reach epidemic levels. A pervasive sense of insecurity and fear drives policy. A sense of never having enough that doesn't correspond with reality. Joanna Macy tells us that more resources have been consumed in the last 50 years than in all preceding human history. The lion's share by us in the Western industrialized world. This will destroy us. David Whyte, the poet, writes about the moment when he knew it was time to claim his authentic gift, the great work of his life. It meant giving up a job. It was a time when his eyes were shining. And he writes, I knew this was the edge at which I needed to live, the line between speech and revelation, hearing and arrival that we capture on paper and call poetry. This was my work, my water, my elemental home, to which I had staggered so awkwardly and so unfaithfully. I resigned my position. There was nothing in my calendar, nothing in our family checkbook. There was no one as yet at the other end of the phone. And I took one last walk on the misted beach, the waves crashing and rolling in as they had for centuries, and I walked that tide line a very, very happy man. The spiritual traditions tell us that the great work of our lives is never just about us. Stephen Cope says the Bhagavad Gita is very clear about this. We find Arjuna, the great warrior, smack in the middle of the cataclysm of the age. And his dharma, calling sacred duty, needs to be discerned and lived out in the midst of that suffering, used in the service of a greater good, aligned with the needs of the time. Cope says, Dharma is born mysteriously out of the intersection between the gift and the times. It is a response to the urgent, often hidden needs of the time. And David Whyte says, the great work of our lives is the place where self meets the world to do what is right for ourselves and good for the world at the exact same time. So the early 1980s was a time of great social change in Central America. There were revolutions, dictators were being overthrown. In Nicaragua, society was being transformed. The needs of the poor were at the center of policy. There was enormous hope in Central America, and the US was waging a war against it. The people in Nicaragua put a call out to the people in the United States, and they said, come, bear witness, see what we're doing. This is the great work of our lives. Accompany us, help us stop the war. Witness for Peace was an ecumenical human rights project that was a response to that call. They had set up an office in Washington, D.C., and it was led by a woman named Yvonne Dilling. I had applied to be part of that team, but there was an age requirement, and I needed to wait for a few months until I was compliant with the age requirement. So I volunteered for a while with Yvonne in that office. And she was recovering from cancer. She'd had a lot of chemo, so she had no hair. And with the energy she had, she was guiding the work of Witness for Peace. And she knew what to do. She had worked for many years in El Salvador with war refugees. And in 1980, the same year that Monsignor Romero was murdered, the same year that thousands of people were fired on with live ammunition when they tried to attend his funeral, the same year that the US churchwomen were murdered in El Salvador, that year in May, thousands of refugees were trying to flee the country and reach refugee camps in Honduras when they were attacked by the military, which was trying to drive them into the Sumpul River, which is the border. And these refugees could not swim. But Yvonne Dilling was with them that day, and she was a strong swimmer. And I Googled it, I found the New York Times article from that day. This is what it says in New York Times. Yvonne Dilling a 26-year-old refugee worker from Fort Wayne, Indiana, spent hours helping hundreds cross the river while a Salvadoran gunship, helicopter, and soldiers rained the area with rockets, automatic weapon fire, and grenades. Miss Dilling tied infants to her body with her bra strap while she swam others across, back and forth, dodging mortar shells. A helicopter wheeled over the water, laying down fire along the rope line where refugees were thrashing their way to safety. Miss Dilling said, "Everything around us shook. Machine gun fire cut up a line in the earth as close as I'm sitting to you right now." But US and Salvadoran authorities denied the massacre on the river that day. But Yvonne was there. She survived it. And she was called to bear witness, to go to the press, to talk to Congress, to talk to human rights commissions. She wrote a book called In Search of Refuge. This was her calling, her dharma, her purpose, born mysteriously in response to the urgent and often hidden needs of the time. And then years later, when I had too many journals full of atrocities of war that US officials denied, and a deep sense of needing to bear witness, but struggled with voices from the dominant culture that I had internalized that said, no one cares what happened there. Weren't they socialists? Some say they were communists. Doesn't matter. Nothing you can do will make a difference. You're never going to make any money that way. Do you have health insurance, by the way? Yvonne Dilling met me on the floor of my chariot. And she said, "Write it. We will get it published." She cherished and nurtured my call, my purpose, my response to the needs of the time. And when I was preparing this talk, I hadn't really intended on talking about either one of those things. But last week, we got a phone call. And it was Yvonne. And I hadn't heard from her in many, many years. She's in Chicago. "Can I come see you?" She'll probably be at my house when I get home. But it reminded me, her surfacing, of how important it is to have mentors that live the great work of their lives and encourage us to do the same. How important it is to have people, friends, and community that tell us, stay with your gift, choose it, guard it, and who show us by example what it means to stay true to ourselves and our full flowering. Today, Yvonne is in San Antonio, Texas. She still works with refugees. She makes her way into the detention centers that are strung along the southwestern border. Often she's the first person from the outside world to get in, to find people, to care about who they are and what has happened to them, and to send word home that they are alive. Today they're called illegal aliens, AUKs, which means unaccompanied children. But they are undeclared refugees from undeclared wars, from a pileup of violence and US policy. And Yvonne continues to show up, to put herself in the service of the times, to follow her purpose, her calling, her dharma, this new great work of her life. The Buddha says, your purpose in life is to find your purpose and give your whole heart and soul to it. Thoreau says, stay on the trail of your own deepest nature. Jane Goodall tells us, listen for the small, still voice, that voice of conscience. Do what that voice says. Parker Palmer says, we must untrain ourselves in trying to bend the world to our will. Vocation does not come from ambition or willfulness. It comes from listening to leadings, the inner, deeper voice. I listen to my life and try to understand what it's truly about. I've been really fortunate to work with Quakers and women religious who are really good at this, at making time to listen to their lives and discerning the needs of the time and finding the place between self and world. They have spiritual directors and clearness committees and workshops and seminars and exercises and retreats. And they understand that the discernment of purpose and call is the responsibility of both individuals and the community, that it's an ongoing process, that it is revisited at different stages of life, of growth and development, that we need to take time to listen to our lives, assess if we are aligned with purpose, assure no bitterness, no self-betrayal, no mortal regret. My friend Maria was in her 70s, about 75, when she found the great work of her life. She was finally able to retire thanks to the pension from her husband, who was a police officer. She moved into the 3rd floor treehouse apartment of her daughter's home. Her church was just blocks away. She could walk to town. She could take continuing ed classes. Her life was perfect. But there was something in her that was not fulfilled. So she went to one of those retreats on vocation and dharma. And she found the place where her gifts met the world's need. That place is called Inglis House in downtown Philadelphia. And for years, she led a spiritual reflection group there for the residents, most of whom, about 99%, were paraplegics. She got into their chariots with them. She named and nurtured and cherished their gifts. She saw what was in them and encouraged them to bring it forth. And they painted, and they did human rights work, and they learned other languages, and they advocated for prisoners on death row. And this was the great work of her life until well into her 90s, and it made her eyes shine. In this community, there are mentors like this. I'll just mention a few. Atlee Williams, who's just 39, but leads community care, is working on getting a peace pole planted, works for the Charter for Compassion. Doris Rux, who isn't here this morning, but might be pushing 40. And she sees the shining eyes of the children in Muskegon Heights. She names, cherishes, nurtures, and brings forth their gifts, and draws many of you in to do the same. Marianne Fisher, who coordinates the music at C3 and in this broader community, nurturing, seeing, cherishing the gifts of these young musicians, encouraging them to stay with their gifts, even if it means living on enough to keep a chicken alive, which you guys probably know how to do, right? Margaret Willey, who encourages children and teens to read and write, who's been honored by the state of Michigan for her contribution to literacy, who brings artists and writers to Muskegon Heights who otherwise would never get there, and to this community at C3. She'll be bringing Dante James, an Emmy Award-winning film producer, to Muskegon and here in October. David Dean, who brings us poets and rappers and encourages people to live a life that guidance counselors in high school are not going to encourage them with. These are all mentors. David White, the poet, again writes, "A life's work is not a series of neatly laid stepping stones onto which we calmly place our feet, but more like an ocean crossing where there is no cut path, only a heading, a direction, which of itself is in conversation with the elements. Looking back, we can see the wake we have left, a glimmering trace on the waters." And I want to share one of his poems that speaks to the need to take a look back at our lives, to make a little time to look at the wake we've left, and to connect to the inner source of direction, that inner blueprint, the inner compass that keeps us on the trail of our own deepest nature, true to our own flowering. So here's his poem. He writes, "But still on the ocean there is no path. Only the needle's trembling dance north, followed without fear. Though the dance now is fear and calmness in one movement. Seeing as you look, not only the angry sea of what you have denied, but here, near at hand, in the center of your body. The rose fire of the compass, blossoming with direction." So this week, we find ourselves between the elements of climate change, with floods to the east and fire to the west, as oil companies continue to dig for the dirtiest and riskiest deposits and push pipelines into wilderness areas and onto tribal lands and waters. I am told that in the United States, the Midwest and the Great Lakes region is the new hub for pipeline expansions, and that in Michigan, the governor recently appointed a new environmental quality regulator to replace the one who left because of the Flint water crisis. And this new environmental quality expert comes from the oil industry. She was an executive and a lobbyist for BP. And in Syria, where there has been no rain to fall from the sky in 5 years, only bombs, where Doctors Without Borders is leaving because of yet another hospital being bombed, and a little 5-year-old child named Omran, pulled out of the rubble after yet another strike, sits shell-shocked in an ambulance, alone, and shows the world the human face of the cataclysm of our age, of the suffering of our times, in the midst of which we must name, cherish, nurture each other's gifts, find our dharma, our calling, align with that inner compass of the heart, do what is right for us and good for the world at the exact same time, and live our lives with purpose. So this week, we're going to ask everybody to take a moment to reflect, to look at the wake of your life and where we are right now, and just ask the questions: am I living mindfulness right now? Am I bringing forth what I am to bring forth? What direction is blossoming in me? The Tiwa Collective writes it this way: what in your life is calling you when all the meetings are adjourned and the lists laid aside and the wild iris blooms by itself in the dark forest? What pulls at your soul? So these are the questions. This is the homework for this week. It's in your bulletin, so please take them home and make time to work with these questions. Just look at them every day. And come Wednesday night for the book discussion at Taylor Street. Come next Sunday to hear Brian Vander Ark. And come next Sunday for the next question about living your life's purpose. Thank you.